right, everybody, welcome back into Cherry Picking. Week 1 of the fantasy hockey season is in the books. Definitely a lot to react to, which is why I'm going to be doing these overreaction videos after every week to kind of see, what is actually something you can trust and what is a fluke right now. Try to debunk some of these big overreactions that you're probably seeing with people picking people up on the waiver wire, if they're worth that pickup. And then anyone who's really exceeding expectations or, doing the complete opposite if they're having a really tough start to the year. Before we get into those overreactions, as always, a video presented by FanDuel Canada, North America's #1 sportsbook, the best place to be locking in NHL wagers, the best place to be really playing any sort of same game parlays as well. FanDuel, you can lock in, do save props, shot props, assists, points, goals, you name it, they've got it. The link is in the description below to download it. Let's get into this week's video. All right, first overreaction. Dylan Guenther will score 50 goals this season. Not quite. Maybe not this year, but I think, somewhere in the 30 to 35 range is probably realistic. Everyone is super high on this Utah team coming into the season. Everybody already was, a full rebrand, thinking they can kind of rebirth the franchise, and it looks like the owner is kind of doing that as well. They're 3-1, but it is 4 games in the season, and Dylan Guenther being at the forefront of all this marketing, along with Clayton Keller as well. 5 goals through their first 4 games. They did lose their first game at the hands of the New Jersey Devils just a couple days ago, but Dylan Guenther, does still lead the NHL in goals with 5. There's a couple guys with 4. Cole Caulfield, Paul Cotter has 4 goals already to start the year. But let's look at some of the stats there. So you can believe these 5 goals, and you can believe the consistency that's going to come from Dylan Guenther. But to say that he's going to score 50 goals in probably his first full season in the NHL could be that's a tall order to kind of live up to. So far through this year, he's 9th in individual expected goals for. He's tied 18th, in shots on net, tied 9th in individual scoring chances. His shooting percentage is 42%, which is incredibly high. I mean, you'll see a lot of these guys who have scored a lot of goals early have that high of a shooting percentage. But for example, Cole Caulfield, he has 4 goals. His shooting percentage is below 30%. His is above 40%. So that's not sustainable. He's not going to continue that. The 50 goal season, I think, is the expectations for that are a little high, but 30 plus goal season, 30 to 35 goal season for sure. And Utah, on the other hand, everyone's saying I think a lot of people now are looking at Andre Tourigny to win the Jack Adams, which I actually do think is a very good bet. If you still can bet that, you can bet that on FanDuel Canada. But it still remains to be seen. Is Utah going to make the playoffs? Are they going to just have just a point jump this year? Or are they going to make that jump to be a playoff team in the West? It does seem like there are some teams in the West that are getting a little bit worse. But Utah, let's look at who they've played. Opening night versus a brand new Blackhawks team. Wouldn't put too much stock into that. Played an Islanders team in their first game, some roster rearrangement, and pretty lucky to win that game, I would say, as well, tying it with less than a minute left and then winning in overtime. And then they got Igor off a shutout, and I don't want to say that's the reason why they scored 6 goals, because they did play really well in that game. Super competitive game, beat the Rangers, but they also just got shut out by the New Jersey Devils and Jake Allen. So we'll see what happens. Let's put our expectations at bay for now, and we'll revisit them 20 games in the season. All right, the second overreaction, Evgeni Malkin will have his first 90-point season since 2018. Honestly, I think this could actually happen. I think some of the old heads on this Penguins team, they have no other option but to just produce at this point, because Kyle Dubas has royally fucked this team, considering what happened with Erik Karlsson, with him being in Pittsburgh now, and his contract that they have to deal with. All of their best players are 35 and older at this point, with Crosby, Letang, and Malkin. But to start the year, even though game 1 was really disappointing, they've looked pretty good. They've looked pretty good against decent teams too. Detroit, Toronto, Montreal's not a great team, but still 7 points in his first 4 games for Evgeni Malkin. He had 0 points against the Rangers, but he had 2 points apiece in the Detroit game and the game against Toronto, and then most recently had a 3-point night against the Canadiens, a team he actually has had a lot of success against over the course of his career. So that's a pretty hot start. Obviously 7 points in 4 games. Let's see how the rest of his years pass, where he's had good seasons, how he started off. Because remember last year, he started pretty hot as well. 4 goals, 4 assists in his first 4 games. They played the Capitals, they played the Flames, they played the Red Wings, and they played St. Louis. So much easier competition than they did last year. Still impressive to have 8 points through the first 4 games, and he ended up playing pretty much the full season and ended up with just 67 points. 2022-23 season, again, a pretty good start. 3 goals, 2 assists, 5 points in his first 4 games played, finished with 83 points. The 17-18 season, where it was his last time, as I mentioned, he scored over 90 points. He had 98 points. His start, 4 points in his first 4 games. He had 13 points in the month of October. So we'll see how that lines up when we get there. And then his last 100-point season, season was in 2012. He had 1 goal and 3 assists, 4 points through his first 4 games. So he's off to a really good start. Now, he is a lot older, so the consistency factor is definitely something you have to worry about, but there's definitely some encouraging numbers here. Like, if you watch that Montreal game, that second line of Malkin, Raquel, and Bunting was buzzing. And the last couple days, they have been doing the same thing. Like, they played really well against Toronto, offensively and defensively, and in Montreal as well. I think that line really stood out in both of those games and looked, honestly, like their first line, and you could see the numbers they're producing. It shows that. Their expected goals for percentage when they're on the ice, the three of them, 70% as a line. That's very high. That's like one of the best in the league, I would say, to start off the year. So opponents to start the year, like I said, haven't been as easy as, let's say, they were in last year's or in years past. There might be some validity in this resurgence here. As I mentioned, old heads taking matters into their own hands here. This is the hand we're going to be dealt. We're just going to do it on our own, Kyle. And it seems like Malkin's kind of just grabbing the bull by the horns here. All right, the third overreaction. Auston Matthews won't score 50 goals. That might be a really big overreaction considering the shooting talent of Auston Matthews. But honestly, I could get on board with him scoring around 50 goals, like 50 to 55. I think the whole dynamic of his play style, and from what I've read and what I've heard, it seems like his play style has changed now that he's the captain and now that Craig Berube is the head coach for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Elliot Friedman said on his podcast on 32 Thoughts that people around the team, people who have watched him closely so far to start the year, have said his play style is a little bit different. Now, if you look at the offense he's creating, doesn't really line up per se, because he's just been super unlucky. Like, he's hit a ton of posts and crossbars because he is 7th in shots in the NHL with 15 so far, 8th in individual expected goals for, and 1st actually in individual scoring chances. So he's still doing a lot offensively. He just hasn't found the back of the net for whatever reason. Ran into a really hot Sam Montembeault in night 1, and they played Jacob Markstrom the night after that, and then that game against Pittsburgh. It seems like the 3rd and 4th line though are carrying a big burden of this, which is I think something Craig Berube wanted to see with this Leafs team, especially early. So that's good for Toronto, just not great obviously for Auston Matthews fantasy hockey owners. However, I do think as the captain, and like I said, under Berube, his role is different. He did finish 3rd in Selke voting last year. I think people tend to forget that or omit that when they're talking about Auston Matthews. And now that Barkov is out for, 2 to 3 weeks or whatever it may be here for the Florida Panthers, he could very well be the Selke frontrunner at this point. Because his defensive game, I think, is very underrated. And if he puts even more thought into it, I think he could be the best two-way forward in the NHL. On top of the fact that he's going to score 50 goals. I think he's going to be more focused on the defensive aspect of his game. And I think that's something Berube wants him to do and something Berube knows is important for the playoffs. So we might as well settle into that role now. So maybe not 70 goals, but listen, fantasy owners, you can deal with 50 to 55 goals. His shots, I bet you, will still be very high total. And I bet you his hits will be a little bit higher if you have those categories. So that's kind of how I see Matthews' season going. All right, the fourth overreaction, the Barbashev, Eichel, Mark Stone first line on Vegas will finish as the highest scoring line this season. They are off to a hot start, but I've seen the numbers for it, and I don't think it's something like that is a way big overreaction. I'm probably you guys are probably hearing that being like, that's just unrealistic. But if you see the way they've been playing so far, they've been playing well. They've outscored their opponents on the ice 6-2 in 3 games. That's very solid defensively and offensively. The line looks really fast as well, but if you look at the actual numbers, they're being outshot. They're being outchanced for a majority of it. They just have talented players on their first line, and right now they're finding the back of the net at a very high rate because their goals for percentage as a line is 75%, while their expected goals for percentage is 44%. So that's going to balance out at some point. When does that start? It's hard to tell. So who are you going to kind of hone in on? Who are you going to focus on in this line? And I think the 2 guys I'm going to trust in staying together are probably going to be Eichel and Barbashev because they played a lot last year in the playoffs near the end of the last, or pretty much for the whole season. Mark Stone was kind of always on a different line. He was hurt, obviously, for the second half of the year for like the 3rd time. And I could see Mark Stone, if anything ends up going wrong, him getting moved off of this line and someone else moving up there, maybe like Victor Olofsson or something like that. So I definitely think that focusing on having Barbashev and Eichel is better than trying to hone in on having Mark Stone or trading for Mark Stone. But it seems like Eichel is going to have a very big year. It just depends who else he's going to be playing with. That is the key guy I'd be focusing on in bigger leagues. Barbashev is definitely, like a good plug and play if you need against bad teams in the West. All right, the last overreaction, Sam Montembeault will win the Vezina. I wish this was true, but it's just not going to happen. Montreal defensively isn't nearly good enough to hold someone to win a Vezina at this point. I know like Carey Price did it, but this is a very inexperienced, young defensive unit and this team in general, obviously with, Cole Caulfield, Juraj Slafkovsky, Alex Newhook, Suzuki, like Doc, all very young forwards. They have some of the older guys on the third and fourth line. But I just don't think that Montembeault can continue at this level, considering the burden he's going to have to carry throughout the season. And I know that's usually a big part of winning the Vezina. Like if you look at Connor Hellebuck last year, everyone's like, oh, Winnipeg was such a good defensive team, but Hellebuck just stood on his head, especially at home. Like he probably had one of the best home seasons, I want to say, ever of a regular season goalie. His goals saved above expected led the NHL. Montembeault currently leads the NHL in goals saved above expected at around like 6. His expected goals against average is 4.16. His actual goals against average right now is 2.3 or 2.03. Sorry. So almost sub 2, which is very impressive and very hard to do consistently as a guy who's going to start. Like he's going to play more games than Caden Primo, obviously. I think he's continued to improve, like compared to when Montreal claimed him off waivers. I think it was from like Florida waived him and Montreal picked him up. He's become a starting goaltender. I just don't know if we want to give him that kind of expectation at this point, considering it's been 3 games. Now, fantasy hockey wise, he's going to have a lot of saves because Montreal is probably going to be outshot for most of the games they play, especially within their division. They just play in a really hard conference and division in general. So they're going to be outshot a lot. So he will be good in terms of getting saves. Now he will win more games than Caden Primo and he will have performances like we saw against Toronto in the opening night. But how many of those will he have? I think it's realistic to say he could have 3 to 4 shutouts this year because I think that kind of performance is something he can do again, but it's only going to be a number of times. So if you're looking for consistency, don't know if Sam Montembeault is the guy you want to go with in fantasy hockey, but if he can act as like your third goalie and you play him in good matchups or matchups where you need a lot of saves, like, and maybe he scrapes out the win that game, could also be a strategy as well. But I could definitely see him finishing as a top 15 fantasy hockey goalie. But Vezina, I don't think that's on the table yet. Thank you guys for tuning in. Let me know what you thought of Fantasy Hockey Week 1 Overreactions. Shout out to FanDuel Canada for sponsoring the video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.